Hello. All right. It is the 14th lesson in the Teach Us Dr. Hirsch Psychology 101 series, which means there are only two left. I think the only ones left are abnormal psychology and clinical counseling psychology. So after that, that's it. So this is the last three. And I've saved some of the best for last. This is a complicated one for me though. So if you were here last stream or you're watching the archive, you know that I am a social psychologist by training. That is the cool little title that is on my doctorate. But the fun little saying that I kind of went through grad school with and in learning the history of psychology is that the rise of social psychology was the death of personality psychology, because as time went on and the gold standard really was explaining human behavior, when you start looking at these studies like Milgram's obedience study and Ash's conformity studies and the Stanford prison experiment, then that really starts to become the zeitgeist of research psychology. And you're looking at these things and you're saying, wow, like ordinary people can do really fucked up things if the situation calls for it. Well, then how do you explain personality, and how much does personality factor in? Turns out it's still good. It's still a good bit, but it's a funny little nuance that these two are next to each other. But I do think they are complementary. So let's talk about personality. We're going to define some terms. What is a personality? We're going to talk about behavioral and social learning theories, because it turns out personality is a thing that people have cared about for a very long time, which means that it has a chart through the history of psychology that goes from psychoanalytics like Freud and Jung and all of them into behaviorism, and then into more social learning and cognitive theories. So we're going to break all these out, get into some humanistic models. We're going to talk about how people actually build up personality assessment tests and how they are validated. We're going to talk about trait models. We're going to see how people define and identify discrete traits in personality. And we're also going to talk about which MBTI scores different anime characters have. So it's going to be a fun one. All right, let's do this. What is a personality? It's very straightforward. You probably already knew this. It's a very intuitive concept. If you have a personality, predispositions to think or behave in a certain way. Personality traits are generally pretty enduring, and they explain some consistency across time and situations. So already I kind of led with that whole idea of the power of the situation and all of that. Well, personality still matters because different people respond to different situations differently. And the same people can respond to similar situations similarly. And that can be explained in part by personality. And we define personality as a composite of different traits or different dimensions of a person. So some people are more or less aggressive. Some people are more or less extroverted. Some people are introverts that are pretending to be extroverts, and those people tend to become vtubers. Now, there are different ways to measure personality and talk about it, so we're going to break this into two broad camps as we get into the history of personality assessment. There is the nomothetic and the idiographic approaches. Nomothetic is a broad study of basically all people. So if you're interested in saying, is extroversion expressed the same way across time and cultures, well, then you're getting into a nomothetic approach. You have a big question that applies to all people. However, there's also idiographic approaches, where you're looking to really drill into an individual person's personality and find a way to understand what's going on in the little brain space there. So let's say Bob became a VTuber in 2020 following lockdowns. Why did Bob become a VTuber? Again, is Bob an introvert? Does that mean Bob is secretly an extrovert? This is a fun little bit for me, just on the notion of introvert versus extrovert. We'll get into it later, but it's funny because I do the streaming thing, so I think of myself as very introverted. I was talking to my partner once and asked her, hey, what do you think I am? And she told me she thinks that I'm super extroverted because I do this streaming thing, and I was like, nah. It's just a funny way, and the way in how we can differ in how other people interpret our personalities and how we interpret them as well. And I think there's also some significance in when we have those kinds of discrepancies and how we make sense out of them. But when we're thinking again about this, going back to the point of departure, the nomothetic versus idiographic approaches, it really comes down to, if you want to apply this way back to like chapter 2, when we were talking about our different dimensions of doing research, this is sort of a broad experiment or a very generalized approach versus, remember, a case study really drilling into one isolated or rare case. That would be the idiographic approach. So what causes a person to have a personality? Is this, or a lack thereof in my case? In some cases, there are genetic factors. We do know there are genetic factors that influence personality. So, for example, if your parents take a personality test and you take a personality test, generally there is going to be a correlation between them. Or siblings. Let's say in a twin or an adoption study where twins are reared apart, there is still going to be correlations between their personalities, even if they were raised in entirely different situations. Meaning, there is some genetic influence on stuff like aggressiveness, extroversion, friendliness, etc. But it doesn't account for everything, because it turns out that our environments do matter a lot. So I am the oldest of 3 siblings. Having grown up in the same family environment, there are some shared environmental factors that can actually impact members of my family. So we're all impacted, and there's a little bit of personality influence that comes from that shared environment. But what really seems to matter when it comes to the situation is the non-shared environmental factors. So like I said, I'm the oldest of 3. Yeah, I grew up in largely the same situation as my 2 siblings, but as the oldest, there are some individual components of that are going to impact me that don't impact my brother, who's the middle child, and my sister, who's the youngest of us. So that kind of unique experience within a family is going to be way more influential than the shared experiences that people have. And so our personalities, these very enduring elements of who we are and how we make sense of ourselves, seem to be a combination of both biological predisposition, that is to say, what we come into the world out of the womb with, our genetic factors, and then a combination of shared and non-shared factors in our environment. And like I said before, a lot of the research on this has been developed using twin and adoption studies. So again, like identical twins, reared apart, different environments, same genetics. What does that impact have on their personalities? Do they end up both being extroverted or introverted? Are they similar people or different? And that's how we kind of know that there are these genetic influences. All right. Well, now we've got the language solidified and we know what a personality is. It's time. Oh God, let me get a sip of my hot chocolate, because this is I'm gonna take immense psychic damage on this one. I have to talk about Freud. You have to talk about Freud. This is especially in all of the chapters that we've covered. This is the one where you really have to talk about Freud, because his ideas are so influential, even if they're not scientific. So how can we break down Freud and make this seem as palatable as possible? Okay, there are 3 primary assumptions in Freud's psychoanalytic theory and personality development. The first one is psychic determinism, and that is to say, nothing is spontaneous, nothing is random, all activity, all mental processes are deeper and are reflective of deeper, meaningful processes. The cigar is never a cigar. That's the old joke, right? It's just not. In the Freud's model, there's no room for anything like that. Every thought you have, every shower thought, is a representation of something that is deeper and meaningful within your own psyche. And as we go through, we can dive deeper and derive those deeper meanings based on the symbolic correspondence with the surface level actions. So there is, with this idea that there is sort of deeper underlying core motivations that are reflected in everything that we do, there's a lot of emphasis in psychoanalytic theory, especially when you're going into Freudian and Neo-Freudian territory, on unconscious motivation. Because you see, we have 3 basic components of our psyche. We have the id, the ego, and the superego. The superego is our internalized sense of morality. We develop this from the situation we are in. It's our internalized sense of social roles. We have the id, which is our basic instincts. It operates on the pleasure principle. It is the natural drive to eat, sleep, have sex. Sex is hugely important with Freud. You can't talk about Freud without talking about sex. And then you have the ego, which is the decision maker. It is our sense of self that is torn between our internalized sense of moral responsibility, of social responsibility, and our id that just wants to, eat, fuck, and be merry. And we have to reconcile these somehow. And the conflict between them is what causes stress. And then Freud would argue that when we have dreams, the dream content is reflecting the intense inner struggle between what we ought to do and what we want to do. And that's, it's kind of the core of a lot of this. It maps very easily onto icebergs and iceberg memes. It's a thing. People visualize this like this all the time. We have our conscious mind and we have our unconscious mind. It consists of the id, the ego, and the superego. We have some conscious accessibility to the superego, but the id is fully underwater. We can't think about the id. We can't reason with the id. The id is this animalistic impulse versus the ego, which we are largely aware of because it's who we are. And the superego, we can probably say what the rules are. We ought to do this. We can do that. It's cool, right? Okay, almost through this. All right. Another core part of how Freud construes personality is through defense mechanisms. The ego is trying to minimize anxiety via defense mechanisms. So we have this tension between the id and the superego, and the ego is trying to stay healthy and stay in control by employing different defense mechanisms. And these break down into, this is a couple of them. I'm not going to get too exhaustive here. But stuff like denial, projection, repression, sublimation, these are all different ways that our ego tries to manage the tension between what we ought to do and what we want to do. So, for example, let's just read from the text. Repression. Repression is the unconscious mechanism employed by the ego to keep disturbing or threatening thoughts from becoming conscious. So the id, it's animalistic, it's violent, it's out of control, and so you repress it. So one of the examples that is given here is that maybe you have, during the Oedipus complex, which we'll talk about in a second, you might have aggressive or violent thoughts towards your same-sex parent, because in Freud's model, the Oedipus and the Electra complex is that you want to, in either case, marry your opposite-sex parent and then kill your same-sex parent. And so, but we know that you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't be violent against your parents. And so you repress that down, and that's the Freudian model there. Or projection, where you take your own unacceptable thoughts and feelings and you project them onto other people. We do this all the time. And these traits and these techniques do still exist in modern conceptions of clinical and counseling psychology, but largely divorced from the psychosexual element that Freud really loved to talk about. Speaking of which, psychosexual development. Freud had interesting ideas here. So basically, the way Freud, again, thought about personality was in the... God. I'm taking a drink. Oh, God. Freud thought about personality development in stages, discrete stages that we go through in different parts of our life. Remember how we talked about in developmental psychology? There are different sort of critical objectives that a person has to meet to get to the next stage of cognitive development in something like Piaget's modeling. In Freud's model, at every stage, at our approximate ages, we have a core source of sexual pleasure, and we have to resolve that to get to the next one. We have to mature past it, and then if something gets messed up, well, then a person might get stuck and develop something like, if you've ever heard of the term oral fixation. Oral fixation comes from this, that it's like, oh yeah, somewhere between birth and 18 months, some wires got crossed somewhere, and the Freudian model would say that some element of your behavior is because you have an oral fixation because you didn't reconcile this core port of development early in life. Same thing with people that are anal retentive, for example. That term comes from psychoanalytic theory, and someone who might develop a complex around, oh my God, it doesn't really make a lot of sense in the language because we use it, Freudian language has been so developed into a different context and meaning from Freud's original one, that when I dial it back and say oh yeah, anal retentive in a Freudian model deals with someone who between 18 months and 3 years had an issue with basically go and poop, and that caused them to become a retentive person later in life. In Freud's model, the conception, this makes a lot of sense. I don't personally think it does, and I'm not going to be silent about it because that's generally the popular conception now. Have you ever heard of, again, the Oedipus or the Electra complex, the idea that at some stages a person might want to kill their same-sex parent to be with their opposite-sex parent? This is, again, something that comes up in Freudian models in the phallic stage between 3 to 6 years. Anyway, moving on. Oh no, I did the thing. I hit the clacky keyboard and hit the N button. Anyway, there we go. Let's talk about the scientific evaluation of Freud. No. It's the short answer is no. It's bad. It's awful. There is basically no scientific merit to Freud. There were some cool ideas. There are cool ideas that people spun off of and made things that they're actually relevant and good and practical later on. But in the substance of it, no. None of Freud's claims are scientific, and they are almost uniformly, if not uniformly, unfalsifiable. They do not predict anything. So for example, repression. Freud would say the reason that we repress things or we forget things is because we are trying to hide our traumatic past from our fragile conscious mind. And that doesn't really map up because people forget positive things too. And this conception of the unconscious mind and everything just doesn't work. A lot of it comes down to bad research methods. Freud was taking neurotic Viennese women, a small subject, a small subject pool, and trying to do idiographic methods, small deep dives into individual people, and then tried to claim that these were super broad and uniformly valid across all people, and they're just not. But that hasn't stopped people from trying to rehabilitate Freud. So neo-Freudians tend to keep the influence of the unconscious, but they try to divorce some of the psychosexual motivations that Freud gets very hung up on. They also tend to be more optimistic about personal growth. If you picked up on one thing there, you might have noticed that with Freud, things can only ever go bad. It's like basically the way Freud considers development and personality is you are on a track. And you are going, and you are going, and you are going, and you are going, and maybe sometimes the train gets derailed. It can basically only go normal or bad in Freud's model, and some people are more optimistic. Take, for example, Adler's style of life, where he tries to shift away from the idea that sex is the core motive for our development, and it's striving for superiority over others. Whether or not that's more positive is... let's just say no, in my opinion. Carl Jung, a also very popular neo-Freudian, who's usually, if you've ever heard of Freud and Jung, it's because they're very similar to each other and spin off of each other a lot. Jung proposed this idea of a collective unconsciousness. Again, there's that term, unconscious influences, that propose that we have memories that are passed down through generations. If I had thought about this joke earlier, this is where I would have had Monsoon from Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance come up and say, "The memes, Jack." So yeah, if you've ever played it, that's basically the idea. Memes are passed down. They're memories, experiences, cultural notions that are passed down through something similar to a collective unconsciousness. Thank God. Done with neo-Freudians. Okay, so mentioned this on the front end as well, but in the history of experimental psychology and psychological research in general, we can identify a couple of discrete phases. We're getting out of the Freudian phase now into the behavioral phase, because behaviorists looked at a lot of what Freud was doing and they thought, my God, please can we get some scientific rigor in here? The geologists are laughing at us. And the physicists don't want to invite us to their parties anymore. So they tried to apply more scientific rigor. And in this, behaviorism decided that personality is basically learning. We bundle habits, and through a combination of classical and operant conditioning, we basically develop habits and quirks and everything, and it's kind of cool. I got a comment here. Freud is the antichrist of scientific rigor. Yes, you're absolutely right. So again, getting back to behavioral approaches, a combination of genetic factors and contingencies, basically how we learn to via reinforcement and punishment, is how we develop a personality. Remember the Skinner boxes? Yeah, B.F. Skinner had a big role in this, because this is the same fundamental processes of learning, where the rat learns to press the lever when the green light is blinking so that it gets fed. That's what basically they're trying to say is the core notion of personality. And that's where we get it from. So, is there an unconscious here? Yes, but not like Freud. And importantly, there is no free will in a radical behaviorist approach to personality. We have an illusion of choice. We come into this world with genetic preferences, genetic predispositions, and then we basically are just black boxes that are responding to our environment, and then whatever enduring traits and habits we learn is what we call a personality. That's the radical behaviorist approach to this. So, learning is important, but thinking also plays a role. So, radical behaviorism, kind of cool, very important to understanding the foundations of learning. However, remember when we talked about on that front end, there are differences between different people will respond to the same environment differently because we think about things differently. And so cognitivists who followed in a reaction to radical behaviorism decided we need to put the mind back in this equation. People think about things, and we have to, even if we can't measure them super well all the time, we have to account for them in our thinking. And so they brought about the idea of a cognitive perspective back into personality research. And so we get into things like reciprocal determinism, where we're trying to say that we are reacting to and influencing our environment. So basically, there is a two-way street where I am, let's say, for example, let's just bring up, like, streaming is a good example. I'm reacting to the stuff in chat. Usually with these streams, I tend to be a little bit less reactive and less interactive than I ordinarily would be, but I am still reading stuff. And so like what you're saying is kind of influencing what I'm doing, and what I'm saying is probably influencing your desire to respond. And so we have some kind of reciprocal interaction going on here. Another point that comes in is our role of observational learning, because we also learn from observation. Because if you're trying to say that the core dynamic of learning is strictly reward and punishment or learned contingencies, it doesn't explain how we learn from observation. And so social learning theories that bring the mind back into it can account for that by saying we can learn by watching other people because we are thinking about what we observe, and we can process and understand how people develop and use skills and all of that. There's also the factor of the locus of control. Do we think that we are really impacted by our environments, or do we have the agency within those as well? These are all different things that are brought back into that behavioral model, but some of those core points, especially the significance of learning, especially early on in life, do reside and are still influential in how we think about personality today. So let's break all this down. We've gone through psychoanalytics to behaviorism to cognitivism. Is there scientific merit here? It's a firmer scientific footing. Radical behaviorists do neglect cognition, and that neglect of cognition is not supported by research. However, in social learning, the emphasis on shared environments is also not supported. Remember with this idea of like reciprocal determinism and all this? We do know that the unique factors of an environment matter a lot. Remember, it's not just being raised with your siblings, it's also, are you the oldest, the middle, the youngest sibling that matter a lot. So social learning theories also don't totally get it. So we keep revising things, and now Carl Rogers, who we'll talk about a lot in the counseling chapter in two sessions, because he has an enormous influence on how people think about therapy and psychological counseling in the modern conceptions. He rejected determinism and embraced free will and tried to shift away from psychosexual desire, away from reciprocal determinism, away from learning. And so the core reason that we develop personalities and the way that we think about personality is trying to derive self-actualization. It's a more positive impact and a more way to frame this. So in his perception, Rogers models personality as consisting of three core components. You got the organism, which is basically what we come into the world with. We have the self, which is how we think about ourselves, again, pulling from cognitivism, and our conditions of worth. Where do we expect, what are the expectations we place on ourselves? And that can result in incongruence. Sometimes you place your worth on, let's say, I'm going to go on Twitch and I'm going to get a bunch of viewers, and then you don't. And that's an incongruence. I value this thing, but I'm not doing it. And then how do you reconcile that? So this is really, and you can kind of see the narrative through here, where some of those elements with Freud, the idea of, the three-component model and all this, do stick around, but we take them in very different directions. Now, again, Rogers is maybe a little bit overly optimistic We know that aggression is inherent across many species, and when we look at cross species or comparative psychology, that seems to hold up. So the conception of the organism of our biological sort of preparedness being inherently positive might not be true, and there's no real experimental evidence and many non-falsifiable assumptions. So humanistic models do tend to be pretty optimistic. They tend to be fun. They tend to feel good, but they're not necessarily the greatest when it comes to their scientific rigor. So now we've gone through the history. Let's talk about traits. How do we think about personality today? So if you try to think about a personality, you probably think about, or how you would describe your own personality, you probably think about openness, extroversion, neuroticism, all these different traits. And that's how we tend to think about it. We try to understand personality by describing its underlying structure. And we use factor analysis as researchers to identify primary traits. Factor analysis is a really freaking cool statistical technique. I happen to be an expert in it. That's weird now that I think about it. But basically, when you're making a scale, what you do is you get a whole bunch of items, and then you analyze it to see which of these items hang together. So you might get your data back and it says, hey, you know, items 3, 4, and 7 seem to hang together really well. And then we have another factor or cluster of responses, and it was 3, 4, 7, 1, 2, and 8, and so on and so forth. And that is used then to condense and identify key clusters or constructs. And that is used to really break out and understand what is a person's personality. One of the most popular models of personality is the Big Five personality inventory. Now, this is based on the lexical approach, which is that all personality traits are present in all language. It's a real challenge. If you're trying to break this down and say, we want to develop a model of personality that is broadly generalizable to all people and all places at all times, that is a real challenge. And so the Big Five model steps in as something that is very broad, but actually does seem to repeatedly come up. These traits, openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, are all frequently found in cross-cultural research and research across time. And so the Big Five as a conception of personality is pretty enduring. Now here's a fun little example. Let's boop back over to Chrome. And I think I've got it over. Here it is. This is one of my favorite scales ever. It's called the TIPI. It's the 10-item personality inventory. Isn't that wonderful? Basically, the TIPI is one of the most face-valid measures I have ever seen, because it measures the 10-item personality inventory looking at the 5 underlying constructs we talked about: openness to experience, neuroticism, extroversion, etc., etc. And it measures them in 10 questions, just saying, on a scale of 1 to 7, rate yourself. It's very direct. It's not giving you an ink blot or giving you an abstract situation and trying to see how you reason through it. It's just like, all right, you want to basically, if you want to know how extroverted a person is, just ask them, hey, are you extroverted? Give me a 1 to 7. Let's say you're feeling pretty good today. It's a 6. You give that a 6. Like critical and quarrelsome, maybe maybe a 5. Dependable and disciplined, definitely a 7. And you go on and you go on and you go on. And then you score it. You just add them up. And so extroversion is scored by adding your score here and extroverted, enthusiastic. And then reverse scoring, item 6, reserved and quiet. So if you said like, well, I give this a 2, well, you reverse score it, that becomes a 6. And you gave yourself a 6 over here, well, you have a 12-point score in extroversion. It's so simple, and it's so obvious that I throw it in almost all my research. Basically, if I'm sitting and if I'm doing a survey and I have 10 questions of room in that survey, I will probably throw the TIPI in there. because then I can just throw different, like, there's so much you can do with personality research, even as a social psychologist. And it's simple. It's pretty sick, actually. So it's a fun little tool. It's one of my favorite things to show students because, well, it's just so intuitive. We get to this idea of personality, and I think a lot of the popular conception of personality falls into a Freudian or neo-Freudian dynamic. A lot of my students would come to this class, like come to my class, and they believe that, personality is this big, complicated thing. You need a battery of tests. You need all this stuff in order to measure it. And then here's the tippy. Hey, 1 to 7, are you extroverted? All right, if you said 7, you're probably extroverted. It's something that's so intuitive and easy. It's I even just love it as a research message when I teach methods or anything like that. Say, hey, you can have a good scale. It only has like 10 items, and it's just very to the point. Thank God for researchers that make short inventories, because if I have to throw in one more 50-item scale into a study and then score it, I'm gonna yell. It's very simplistic. But the thing is, it actually predicts a lot. And it's like when people do more elaborate inventories of the big 5 traits, they tend to correlate with tippy scores. So if I gave you a big 100-question battery that was designed to identify your score and rate you on these 5 categories, the tippy tends to perform just about as well as these big, very complicated and very intricate inventories and tools that people will give someone to measure their personality. So does the big 5 actually matter? I mean, because that's the gold standard here. We want to predict behavior. And whether it's social psychologists trying to predict behavior by the situation, or it's personality psychologists trying to predict behavior based on personality traits, yeah, there are many real-world behaviors that do matter and do correlate with the big 5 inventory. People that are higher in conscientiousness, so they tend to take better care of themselves, tend to be physically healthier and live longer. People that are, again, also higher in conscientiousness might also study more. They are more mindful of the situation and their relationships with other people. They might do better at their job. They might get better grades. And there are relatively similar traits seen across cultures. Prevalence might be different. But if that standard really is to say, we wanted to develop this very general this idea in the 5-factor personality inventory, in the big 5. This is a way of talking about personality that works everywhere, and everyone can understand what these things are, and you can use these measures anywhere in the world. It seems that the research supports it. These 5 traits do show up time and time again. So yeah, openness, neuroticism, agreeableness, extroversion, and conscientiousness seem to be a pretty solid foundation for how we measure and understand personality. Yeah, so there's big evidence here. Now, there is some argument about trying to predict very specific behaviors. And this is kind of the conundrum that really gets in the way of a lot of statistics. So the reality is, if you flip a coin, you know that the odds, like a perfectly fair coin, the odds of getting tails are 50%. But you flip it and you get heads, and you flip it and you get heads again. How do you make sense of that? Because the thing is, statistics and a lot of psychological theory are not designed with the intention of predicting a specific isolated event. They're about predicting big patterns of behavior over time. So Sam might be higher in extroversion. That is not going to predict whether or not Sam goes to the party next week if you invite him. But it is going to maybe predict if you go and compare the number of parties and social gatherings and functions that Sam attends over the course of his whole life, he might go to more than someone who is lower in extroversion. So it's not about predicting a specific trait. I mean, if you were to try to predict a specific trait, I'm going to throw out a personal example again. I'm a pretty introverted and reserved person in real life, but I spend a lot of my free time putting a lot of effort into streaming and all of this, which, like I kind of led on the front end, caused my girlfriend to think that I'm more extroverted than I consider myself to be. The specific traits that I have would probably say like, yeah, she probably wouldn't want to do that. And yet I do, because it's about aggregate behaviors, not about specific things. So there are some general criticisms that are somewhat valid, because we are trying to look again at these big behaviors and the big picture, not so much the small discrete things. But if the goal is to predict behavior, well, then it would ideally be great if we could predict specific events. So it's one of the interesting conundrums of, even as someone who considers herself at this point more of a statistician, the interesting conundrums, because like I can build a model that fits the data very well, but it's not going to be good at predicting an individual person's behavior. It's going to be good at predicting behavior in the aggregate among when you're looking at all people. So does personality change? Yes, there is some variability, but it does tend to even out a little bit after the age of 30, and maybe a little bit afterwards. In general, people tend to get a little bit less extroverted, a little bit less neurotic, a little bit less open, more conscientious and more agreeable as they get older, and then it tends to even out once you get to 30. Now, what's important to keep in mind, though, again, is the situations that people find themselves in. I am personally very curious what this research is going to look like in 5 to 10 years, because there has been such a tremendous shift in what people's 30s look like because of the economic conditions that have come about. So back in the day, it's like the old meme, you know, my parents when they were 20, me when I'm 20. There was a very different set of expectations and material reality for a lot of people when they hit their 30s. Like when my parents were growing up, they owned a home, it's like had a kid, they owned a home, and like had a really very stable life. And as now their kid in her 30s, I don't have that same level of stability. So some of that decrease in neuroticism and openness and extroversion might be because in the aggregate around the age of 30, when people were doing a lot of this fundamental research, people were able to get, you know, more stable jobs and buy homes, etc. And that just doesn't seem to happen that much, or isn't as common anymore or as accessible. So I'm curious what this is going to look like in a couple of years. But for the time being, we gotta report it as the research says. Also very true. Also very true. So a comment here of being trans in your 30s. As someone who is also trans in their 30s, I am so different and so much more extroverted and so much, I think, kinder and more openness to experience after 30 than I was in my 20s, where I was a big neurotic asshole. So yeah, shit happens. And again, it's about predicting things in the aggregate than identifiable individual trends. So there's a whole different kind of thing going on there. It's a very complicated way of trying to predict things. And this is sort of where I think personality is so fun to talk about, but it's hard to talk about academically because we all come to it with our own experience of our own personalities and our own life courses. And so we can look at these sort of broad trends and talk about the broad theory. But the theories never match up to individual experience. Sorry, I inhaled some cocoa powder in my hot chocolate. Give me a second. Oh, that's great. That's great. I went to the phrenology slide and stop for a second. Well, it was going to happen. Let's talk about phrenology. Because personality assessment has been plagued by dubious methods basically as long as anyone has been trying to assess personality. Back in the day, if there was a very prevalent pseudoscientific movement that we call phrenology, which posited that the personality was because of grooves in the head and the shape of the skull, and that, you know, people that have big foreheads might have bigger, because it intuitively made sense to people before we had things like fMRIs and even EEGs or anything like that, because you could just like try to imagine what a person's brain looked like by looking at their skull. And the thought is like, if you had different bumps or ridges or anything like that, you might have a different personality because your brain looks different, right? Ugh. Yeah. So if you stick a hot poker up their nose and smooth out the brain a little, you can fix their personality. Yeah, that was the underlying thought behind the lobotomy. Ugh, I just thought about in my studies, I've had to like see the lobotomy videos and like go like and think about like, oh yeah, you just go up and you scramble someone's frontal lobe. What happens? And it's like nothing good. That's the answer. Nothing good. It's actually insane. Like, oh god. Oh no. No, let's not talk about the lobotomy. Let's not talk about the lobotomy. Ugh. I need some cocoa. Thank God. Ugh. Ugh. Nothing gives me nightmares like lobotomies. Like it's like if there's one thing that just gets under my skin and is like even very hard to talk about when I'm doing these, it's lobotomies. When it comes up, chronology and all this just gives me the heebie-jeebies. So moving on. There's a long history of dubious methods when it comes to the study of personality. And some of them work out pretty well. And part of this is because personality is an easy target for pseudoscience. Everyone tends to have their own beliefs and anecdotal experience with personality, so BuzzFeed quizzes, this is the only time I'll ever talk about, the noted turf J.K. Rowling on here, but like Pottermore. When Pottermore came out, people in my, even my grad program, were geeking out about it because it gave them their Hogwarts house, and they thought that this was about personality. Now, what's interesting is like, in grad school, I knew a huge Harry Potter head who actually did an empirical study where they took Pottermore housing assignments and they asked people to complete, I think it was the Tippy actually, the 10-item personality inventory. And they found out that like, what was it? What was their outcome? People into Slytherin were actually higher in dark triad traits like Machiavellianism and sort of like antisocial personality traits. People in Gryffindor tended to be higher in extroversion, and then basically everyone else was Hufflepuff because Hufflepuff is just like the catch-all house. So it was interesting to see good that they were doing that research, and it was, sometimes academics get to do fun things. So there was some underlying truth there, but not a lot. So I can feel it looming. It's like a shadow lurching over me. I have to talk about the MBTI soon. So this leads us into structured personality tests, multiple choice surveys, some of which are pretty interesting. So the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or the MMPI, is probably the most researched personality assessment tool in the market. There are 10 basic scales to it, and it is really actually factually used to detect symptoms of mental disorders. And it consists of 567 true-false questions. 567 questions. It is a massive exam. But it was developed using empirical methods of test construction. And this is why I think this one is very, very interesting. They're all yes-no questions, and they were selected not because they make sense, but because for whatever reason, when they went there, remember I talked about factor analysis, where you identify which items tend to hang together? Those items hang together. They might not make sense, but they do. And it's a very weird test to look at because of it. Because it's not like it matters what the question is. They just know that for whatever reason, this measures neuroticism. Let's take a look at it. Up and down, here's the Tippy, here's the MMPI. These are the actual original MMPI-2 questions. Now, interestingly enough, the scoring guide you basically can't find on the internet for good reason, because I don't think they want people to take these questions and say, I have schizophrenia. It's not the intention of the exam. But this is very interesting, right? Let's take a couple of these questions and think about what's here. Remember, 571 true-false questions. Going down, going down, going down, going down. Look how long this is. Look how many questions there are. And they get into stuff like, I like to drive a hard bargain. Let's see. I have made lots of bad mistakes in my life. At movies, restaurants, and sporting events, I hate to stand in line. Let's see, what's another fun one? Some of them are very, very, very on face. Like, I have a drug or alcohol problem. But things like ghosts or spirits can influence people. Dirt frightens or disgusts me. I am often annoyed when someone tries to get ahead of me in line. What are some other good ones that are floating on here? Let's see. I like mechanic magazines. Like, I read popular mechanics. Let's see. My sex life is satisfied. I would like to be a singer. Evil spirits possess me at times. Like, these are all questions that are driven specifically because they identify some kind of trait. It doesn't matter if they make sense on face, because they don't. A lot of them just seem weird. If I were to sit down and generate a list of items to measure personality, I would not pick a lot of these. But they do map onto important things. And so they end up in the actual exam itself. So when we think about validity, though, there are also 3 validation scales that are hidden in there. So in the 567 questions, there are also 3 subscales: lying, frequency, and correction, that are designed to measure a person's impression management, malingering, and whether or not they are being defensive. So it is basically designed to assess all these different questions, and then some of them are just landmines that are designed to measure whether or not you're lying on your other responses. It's a wild inventory. And if you're a psychometric person like me, you like measures and you like statistics, this is a wild study, or a wild set of studies and a wild validation to really dig into. So what does it actually look like? Well, this is what it might look like when you actually get there. So how do they know if I lie? That's a good question. So basically they would ask questions like, I occasionally become angry. That's basically true of everyone. So if you were to say, I never become angry, that's probably a lie. Or sometimes we'll put in questions in my own research that we know are impossible. So I put questions, especially in longer surveys, I'll put a question in there like, I rode a unicorn to work today. I know that is impossible. So if a person agrees with that question, I can generally rule out that person and say, like, they're probably just clicking responses, or they're not really thinking about things in the way that I want them to. So how does this actually work? Well, the actual subscales here, again, we have lying, we have frequency, we have correction, but we also have stuff like hypochondriasis, depression, hysteria, psychopathic deviations, masculinity or femininity, paranoia, psychiatric anxiety, schizophrenia, hypomania, and social introversion. Basically, all of these different scales, you get rated on them, and then a clinician who's been trained in this measure, or a statistician, can then interpret them. Like I said, this is actually used for trying to actually identify symptoms of real psychological disorders. And most of them tend to be very valid and very reliable, which is wild to me when you look at some of these items and they seem like they're just thrown in there, but they, for whatever reason, do predict all these different factors. It's goofy. But there are problems. Some of the scales are actually highly redundant, and it's not designed for a formal diagnosis, but rather to maybe suggest that maybe a person should explore further testing. So if I test really high in depression, that doesn't necessarily mean that I have clinical depression, but rather that, like, maybe that's a thing that I should talk to a psychologist or a clinician about. And again, like, but some things are actually, again, highly correlated. So I'm going to go ahead and say, I'm going to make a wild guess here. So we know that depression is pretty good. It's we know that depression and anxiety, which is over here, the PT is like 75 and 80. Those are going to be highly correlated. Depression and anxiety hold together basically 100% of the time in clinical research. Like hysteria, also highly correlated with anxiety, and hypochondriasis. So you can see, if you wanted to apply factors to this, anxiety, depression, hypochondria, all that are probably going to hold together very well, which is a criticism here. That it's like, are these scales all important? Because when you have 567 items, there is an argument to be said, maybe you could drop some of these because they don't seem to be holding together super well. Or they hold together too well. The opposite of what I said. Okay. All right. Here we go. I think it's time. We're going to talk about rational and theoretical tests. They begin, you write out a trait, and then you write items to assess that conceptualization. So it seems like it's the opposite of the MMPI, right? The MMPI is we have a bunch of items, we don't know why, but they measure what we want them to measure. So we're going to keep doing that. This is the opposite. You write something like the tippy. You want to know about extroversion? You ask about extroversion. And some of these are very good, like the revised measures, like the revised Big Five, etc. Some of these are not. Time to talk about the Myers-Briggs, because these things will not die. They are everywhere. They haunt my dreams. I cannot stand this frickin' measure. So the MBTI, or the Myers-Briggs type inventory, tries to posits that every single person fits somewhere on this grid. And you have, achoo, I mentioned the Myers-Briggs and I had to sneeze. Based on these different traits, either you're introverted or extroverted, maybe you are a sensing person versus a knowing person, you are a thinking person versus a feeling person, you are is it perceiving is the last one versus judging. Based on those combinations, you fall somewhere into the wild world of personality. And so you fit somewhere into these boxes. And then people tend to run with this and take far more out of it than they should, because it doesn't really predict much at all. So let's give a short list of things that are more valid than the MBTI. A list of your favorite VTubers probably says something more about your personality than your MBTI score. If you were to pick a set of characters from this list of anime characters that have been assigned MBTI ratings, that actually probably says more about your personality than anything else. If you have VTubers, all this, whether or not you like cats or dogs, probably says more about your MBTI than anything about your MBTI score. What you think your MBTI is probably says more than your actual MBTI score. So if you take this and you say, no, I am definitely like Griffith. I definitely am an ENTJ, but I took the test and it told me that I'm an INFP. I don't agree with that. Therefore, that probably says more about your actual personality, what you want your MBTI to be, than the actual score says. Another thing is, it doesn't actually even hold up over time. So in the times that I've taken this, I've been an INFJ, an ENTJ, and an INTJ in the last 3 times I took it. It shifts around because people's personalities and moods and the way that people respond to the questions on the MBTI also change. So question here, does your favorite set of Guilty Gear Rev 2 say more about that than your MBTI? The answer is yes. It does. And my personal favorite set, if we're going to get into it, is Mecha MacGyver versus Omni on Tension Pulse. So if you want, you can just search for MBTI. There are a bunch of different variations on it. Let's see. Myers-Briggs personality test. If you just go and take you can go to the 16 Personalities website and you can actually take it right there. And it will give you maybe, I think it's like 40 questions here. Maybe I'll take this in public and see how it goes. Also, another personal favorite of mine, if you're ever curious about it, you can also go to Personality Database. Oh yeah, also a classic. Why Are You Standing Up? Washige versus Ogawa. Was it Evo 20 something something? Yeah, good sets. Good sets. Anyway, if you go to Personality Database, you can check this out. Every now and then there's a viral social media post that goes around that will say go take the Myers-Briggs and then go pick a number of characters that you vibe with. Honestly, the characters you pick that are within that category, again, probably say more about your personality than anything to do with the actual category, if that makes sense. So it's what you pick out and the choices that you make probably matter more than the thing itself. Funny, right? Anyway. Yeah, favorite VTubers, what you think your MBTI, I could go on and on. Your favorite Sailor Scout, your favorite Precure series, all these things matter so much more than the MBTI. And that doesn't stop people from getting tattoos. And people just keep getting tattoos of their MBTI score. They take this one 40-item inventory and they're like, well, the online test told me that I'm an INTP. And that's literally my identity for the rest of my life. I hear only 1% of people are INTJs. However, literally everyone on the internet seems to be one. Ugh. I'm moving on. Yeah. So is there a similar personality test with colors? There's all kinds of tests that fall into this point of like the colors of personality. I mean, I think we talked about this with aura reading too. There are people that will say, oh, you can like do special photography effects to visualize a person's aura, and that says something about a person's personality. You can go on and on and on with pseudoscience tests. The MBTI is just the one that I find to be the goofiest. But it's fun. I get why people like it. It's fun to take it and see what score you get. Like I said, I'm probably going to take this when we get done. So let's see. Projective tests. These are based on how people respond to different ambiguous stimuli. So the idea is that if you interpret something, you're projecting an element of your personality onto it. Now, these are controversial, but they're worth talking about. So the Rorschach ink blot test is used by some people to measure personality. And so you'll show people black and white and colored ink blots, and you ask people what it resembles. And then depending on who you ask, some people say that it reveals personality traits. So for example, let's look at this one here. You see this, right? Let me capture my cursor. I look at this and I think about my dog sleeping on a bed, and like this is her little head, and this is her eye, and this is her ear, and this is her back, and here's her tail, and this is like her front legs, and this is her back legs. But there's a second dog, and that's this is projecting my desire to have two dogs. That's what I take away from ink blots. If you can tell, I don't put a lot of stock into these things. But they're fun. They're fun to talk about. They're fun to mess with. Rorschachs, basically, when it comes to any level of reliability, they suck. They don't predict anything. They don't predict disorders. People, like, if you give someone the same ink blots a week apart, they might give you different answers. There's huge amounts of, and here's the funny part. Oh my god, here's the catch-22 of this. You need to have a rater, a specialized person, to score the response the person gives you, which means the person rating it is projecting onto the ambiguous interpretation of the stimuli from the person that they're rating. So it's just a whole mess. It sucks. And it doesn't contribute to anything over what we already have with just directly asking people. That's the gold standard here. Incremental validity. Is this giving us insight beyond a more easily administered test? And when it comes to personality, remember the Tippy? It's 10 questions. Are you extroverted? Yes or no? Hey, if your personality assessment doesn't give me insight beyond me just asking the person, hey, what's your personality? It's not worthwhile. Relatedly, we have thematic apperception tests, which are where you give people a story. You give them a picture, you ask them to make a story. So we show this person, here is a photo, this is a person, and you give no other detail, no other prompt, and you say, what do you think is happening here? And that's a thematic apperception test. The other projective test that maybe I use is the draw a person test, where you just ask someone to draw something. People will analyze handwriting. There's all kinds of stuff with projective tests, and they're all bad. You see, one of the big pitfalls of personality assessment is that people tend to accept highly base rate descriptors as accurate. We talked about this before, too, with tarot readings and astrology. You can just give people a basically machine-generated horoscope. Tell them that it's about a person born on their birthday, and they will find some way to make it personally relevant. Overall, personality assessment might be useful, but only if you're using valid and reliable instruments. Ink blots, the MBTI, the list goes on, and they just aren't useful. They don't actually predict anything. And that's what I got for this week. So that's a brief history of personality testing, the history of personality development, and how we think about all this stuff. So I hope you had a good time here. There's only 2 more of these to go. So I think next week is abnormal, and then we're talking about clinical counseling after that. So I am going to stick around here for a bit and just chat. And I because I am a masochist that likes to debase myself before the machine, I'm going to take the MBTI and then find a group of anime characters that match to it. So let's end for here and transition over to office hours. I hope you have a good one, and I'll see you next time.